My name is Tamar Sternthal, and I'm Camera's Director of Media Research and Analysis. We are living in truly historic, unprecedented times. In the Middle East, countless seismic events have rocked the region in such a tiny stretch of time, just 641 days. Hamas's mass invasion of southern Israel, the murder of 1,200, rampant incidents of rape and sexual abuse, the kidnapping of 251 women, men, children, and elderly, Israel's ongoing war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the evacuation of more than 100,000 Israelis in the north and the south for well over a year, Israel's sci-fi-like beeper and walkie-talkie operations in Lebanon, a huge blow to Hezbollah, which paved the way for a shift in balance of power and deterrence. With Hezbollah in disarray, Syrian President Bashar Assad lost critical backing, and his regime suddenly toppled. Israeli troops are installed in parts of southern Syria, assisting the Druze and protecting Israel's border. Now, under the leadership of Ahmed al-Shara, who was formerly associated with al-Qaeda in Syria, Syria is in President Trump's sights as a candidate for normalization with Israel. Twice last year, Israel and Iran came to direct confrontation, with the Islamic Republic launching hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones across Israel, and the Jewish state successfully wiping out Iran's air defense system. Ongoing ballistic missile and drone attacks from the Houthis in Yemen and assaults on international shipping drew U.S. and Israeli strikes against the Iranian-backed terror organization. 4 crewmen in a Greek-owned ship were killed in fresh Houthi attacks this week. After pushing back against Iran's allies across the region, and following Iran's failure to enter into a nuclear agreement, Israel last month confronted the head of the so-called Axis of Resistance with an impressive, successful, and well-coordinated multi-pronged attack on the Islamic Republic's nuclear and military facilities. Included in Israel's arsenal was a clandestine drone base within Iran. Iran attacked Israeli cities with direct hits on residential neighborhoods in Bat Yam, Ramat Gan, and Beersheba, among elsewhere, where the surgical ward of Soroka Hospital also took a direct hit. Israel's attacks paved the way for the U.S. strike on Fordo and other key nuclear facilities. After these stunning events came the abrupt U.S.-brokered ceasefire, with Israeli pilots turning around mid-air as President Trump demanded their recall. These enormous, fast-paced events have eclipsed other hugely significant moments which would have been major news in normal times, like the IDF's recovery of the body of soldier Oren Shaul, whom Hamas held hostage for more than a decade. The epic developments have not only unfolded at breakneck speed, they've also played out within a turbocharged 24/7 news reporting cycle. In this hyper-paced coverage, headlines refresh every few seconds, and media outlets' fact-checking departments have endured, as well as Hamas's collapsing command structures in the Gaza Strip. The journalistic and Middle Eastern landscapes of today would be completely unrecognizable to Camera's original research staff of 1982. A Camera researcher myself since 1999, I was around to observe many of these morphing journalistic conditions. A few years ago, I gave presentations about how the media landscape evolved over 2 decades, reshaped by new technologies, platforms, and business models driven by social media clicks. Since Camera's founding, international media coverage has also grown increasingly globalized. Coverage in one language and in one country reverberates well beyond that language and that country. Camera has likewise evolved and adapted to effectively counter anti-Israel bias in the rapidly changing media environment. For instance, we have addressed the globalization of media by establishing our Spanish, Hebrew, and then Arabic departments. Camera's uniquely integrated multilingual approach translates into more successes across the board, amplifying our global impact. In another adaptation to the times, Camera has become the de facto outsourced fact-checking department for legacy media institutions, which have gutted their own internal systems of fact-checking and corrections. In recent years, Camera's rigorous and tireless approach has resulted in record numbers of corrections in major media outlets in English, Arabic, Spanish, and Hebrew. In 2024, we prompted an unprecedented 642 corrections countering false, sloppy, or biased reporting, which often demonized Israel. This year, we are on track to beat that figure, having elicited 381 substantive corrections to date. In this digitally dependent era, media corrections are more important than ever. Corrections not only appear buried in page 3 of the print edition, they live for perpetuity in the digital edition, or at least as long as the article remains online. Those critical corrections also appear in Congressional Research Service content consumed by lawmakers and their staffers responsible for funding recommendations and allocations. In addition, news databases append the correction to the original article, ensuring that journalists, policymakers, students, researchers, and others of goodwill will not rehash the misinformation. Thus, corrections can have long-lasting policy implications for potentially life and death matters. Moreover, in this era of post-journalism, where social media reigns supreme and many of the traditional guardrails of accountability have disappeared, corrections put journalists on notice, alerting them that they will be held accountable for misreporting, whether the cause was sloppiness or maliciousness. Corrections on key issues can prompt policy changes at media outlets. Such institutional changes are long-lasting and impactful. Finally, corrections at significant media outlets can be used to leverage corrections and better coverage at other media outlets, even in different countries and different languages. In this way, we prompt systemic change, improve coverage on a global level. Adapting to the digital climate, Camera also staked out a strong social media presence on Meta, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, with some 500,000 followers across our various platforms. But we are now in a new, unique, and unprecedented moment of history, as I said, and it requires new strategies and enhanced assets. Not only are we facing all the aforementioned challenges, we are also encountering an alarming spike in anti-Semitism fueled by both shallow social media and a weakened mainstream media, which is more and more abandoning its long-standing commitment to ethical journalism. 20 years ago, anti-Semitism played a very marginal role in mainstream media coverage. Now we must directly address and confront the fact that the most ancient bigotry has become mainstreamed in legacy media coverage of Israel. Fully attuned to all of these challenges, Camera is in a stage of critical strategic growth, in which we aim to drastically expand our reach and step up our impact. Our plan is to shore up our media research department, onboarding more talent to send daily correspondences to editors and reporters, urging better coverage and corrections. Our increased staff will expose media missteps and pen educational op-eds in a variety of publications, including the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, Washington Free Beacon, Boston Globe, National Review, and many more. Our columns, those on our own platforms, and those published externally in American, British, Israeli, or Spanish media outlets, educate millions of readers about media bias and shine a light on information ignored or downplayed in news coverage. Additional staff will also be able to supply our members with more of the critical information they require to write their impactful letters. Our skilled team combines top-notch research abilities with a deep understanding of journalism. Its only fault is that it's not big enough, and we're going to fix that. We're also going to step up our social media capacity to amplify our impact by reaching larger audiences, including younger people who themselves are shaped by social media. To reach more of the scrolling generations, we are creating social media content with more graphics and less text. We will also further develop our TikTok presence. Appealing posts on these various platforms link to the full articles appearing on our sites. There, our longtime supporters can find all our material with its trademark depth and quality, the ultimate strength of Camera's unique work. We think more people representing a more diverse demographic can benefit from and appreciate our team's tremendous work and accomplishments. With that in mind, I introduce you to today's three panelists who are behind so much of Camera's impressive content. They will draw on their vast knowledge and experience to identify current themes in the coverage of events in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. From their perch as veteran Camera researchers, they will reflect on which old biases have managed to persevere in our new environment and what newer phenomena have emerged in recent coverage. Senior research analyst David Lippman, Camera UK co-editor Adam Levick will now speak for a combined 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll go to Q&A. We probably won't be able to cover every question and comment, but please know that we will read and consider everything you submit. And now I turn it over to David Lippman. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Tamar. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm going to, as stated, we're going to talk a little bit about the media coverage of Israel, and in particular, the 12-day war, and compare it a little bit with the coverage of the war between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists in Gaza. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about overall quality of coverage, in particular, what we saw between from the media in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. And I'm going to begin by actually saying that the coverage was relatively positive, especially in comparison to what we have seen in coverage of Israel's other conflicts, whether it's with Hamas or Hezbollah. And I think there's a few fundamental reasons why that was. The first reason is the inapplicability of the usual ideological narrative or framing that we typically see coming from the media in its coverage of Israel. The typical oppressor versus oppressed framing that we often see coming from mainstream media these days simply will not apply when you're talking about a country of Israel that's about the size of New Jersey and has a population of less than 10 million, and a country as large as Iran with a population of over 90 million that had widely been considered to be the regional hegemon. So the usual ideological framing simply didn't apply, and that dramatically shaped the coverage of the conflict between Israel and Iran. The second reason is that we were talking about a very different kinetic warfare environment in Iran in comparison to what we see in Gaza. And what do I mean by this? Well, for one, obviously, Iran is a lot less densely populated than Gaza. And on top of that, in Iran, you did not have that sophisticated decades-long effort to build military infrastructure underneath, inside, and around civilian centers throughout Gaza as part of a deliberate military strategy that you see in Gaza. Yes, there were military targets that were inside civilian areas, but it was a lot less frequent in Iran in comparison to what we see in Gaza. And also, of course, the military goals of the IDF were very different in each situation. In Iran, it was much more targeted. We were hitting nuclear targets, ballistic missile targets, regime generals, regime scientists, whereas in Gaza, the IDF is aiming to, in effect, completely destroy Hamas, as well as free the hostages, which is, of course, a much more complicated ask than what we see in Iran. And it means there's going to be a lot more potential for mistakes, for tragedies, in a way that just wasn't going to happen given the context in Iran. Similarly, there was a very different information warfare strategy environment going on. Whereas Hamas has built an entire strategy around portraying itself as victims and highlighting Palestinian casualties, which itself tries to drive up in order to garner international outrage and pressure on Israel. In Iran, they're more interested in projecting an image of strength, projecting themselves as the leader of, as Tamar said, the axis of resistance, pushing back against Western hegemony and fighting the United States and Israel. And this kind of information strategy simply does not work with Western media in the same way that Hamas's propaganda works quite brilliantly on Western journalists. So with all that said, I'm going to jump a little bit into some of the specific themes that we saw coming out of the coverage of the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, and talk a little bit about how that might compare with what we see in Gaza. And one of the first themes I'll highlight in my brief time is the coverage of the Israeli strike on the broadcasting center in Tehran that was owned by IRIB, the Iranian State Broadcasting Authority. And what we saw was, of course, and for those of you who might not remember, this was the strike. We all saw the video of the reporter, or talking about the Zionist planes overhead, and then suddenly a bomb falls and she gets up and walks away. Very dramatic. What we saw is a lot of outlets, including Associated Press, Financial Times, the BBC, largely omitting important details, namely that IRIB is an Iranian state asset, but even more than that, that it is directly connected to the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, that it has been used in human rights violations, like broadcasting forced confessions of torture victims, and has also been a key component in running Iran's information warfare strategy abroad. And these details were largely omitted. You can compare it somewhat to the strike in 2021 on the Associated Press building in the Gaza Strip, the building which it also happened to share with some Hamas terrorists who were using it for some very alarming military purposes. And in the coverage of that Israeli strike, those details about the Hamas presence and embedding inside that same building were largely omitted or downplayed in media coverage. Another theme, which kind of combines false equivalences, projecting, or you might also describe it as kind of co-opting the charges that Israel has made against its enemies and trying to turn them against Israel. So some of the examples I pulled, we saw that CNN tried to suggest that Israel was, quote, attacking residential areas, and that this had somehow opened the door for Iran to target residential areas. Now, of course, this is absurd. We all saw the images of the Israeli strikes that did happen. The few that did happen in residential areas were targeted strikes in which you can see the missile will hit a single floor or sometimes even a single unit to take out the target while leaving the rest of the building intact. And you compare that to the very targeted strikes by the ballistic missiles from Iran that intended to level entire residential areas throughout Israel. They meant to kill civilians. They didn't mean to hit specific military targets, whether it be Iranian generals or Iranian nuclear scientists. Similarly, at the BBC, we saw them uncritically amplify some Iranian propaganda about supposed military sites near Soroka Hospital. And we saw this at many outlets, not just the BBC. Of course, this was straight propaganda from Iran that came without evidence, but it was an attempt to reverse Israel's charge that Hamas has built its military sites in and around and underneath hospitals throughout Gaza. And this was an attempt to try to create some kind of false equivalence. Of course, the difference is Israel has actually provided proof of military sites in hospitals in Gaza, whereas Iran's supposed evidence was very clearly false. It didn't withhold or stand up to any amount of scrutiny. Another key theme that we saw was efforts to really downplay the Iranian threat. And this occurred in a number of ways, and I could provide countless examples, but given limitation on time, I'm just going to provide a few. Here is one that came from everybody's least favorite CNN anchor, Christiane Amanpour, who made an error. I have a brief clip I'll show here.
So the latest after an Iranian barrage into Israel that struck near a hospital and caused damage.
Of course, if you caught that, she was talking about the missile strike that hit Sorok Hospital directly, but Amanpour suggested it hit near the hospital. And we saw this repeatedly where they were attempting to downplay whether the hospital was hit or not, and thus downplaying the actual harm that these Iranian missiles were causing to Israeli civilians and civilian structures. Other examples abound. We saw the BBC, they had a verification article about, or they tried to do some verifying about the Iranian nuclear program, and through it, they completely omitted all of the evidence of Iran's actual nuclear weapon ambitions. We saw at New York Magazine, they used a picture of the horrific destruction that happened in Ramat Gan, Israel, from a ballistic missile strike, and claimed that it was actually the result of an Israeli strike in Iran. At CNN, we saw that they used Iranian regime claims about the number of casualties that were civilians, but then in the same sentence, they completely omitted the fact that every single Israeli civilian was civilian. And of course, this is again an effort to really downplay the threat Iran is posing to Israeli civilians. We also saw, and not pictured here, but a astonishing example for me is we saw a CNN article that tried to suggest, and this ties it back to Gaza and the effort to downplay the threat faced by Israel on many fronts, not just Iran and Gaza, but also Lebanon, Yemen. They tried to suggest that Israelis were not used to having used bomb shelters until the 12-day war with Iran. Of course, anyone who lives in Israel and anyone who knows people in Israel knows that they have been very familiar with their bomb shelters for the last 25, 30 years of constant rocket and missile attacks from Gaza, from Egypt, from Syria, from Lebanon, and from Iran too. Another final theme I'll raise is what you might call low quality analysis. And what we see in outlets like CNN or the Financial Times when they try to have an analyst provide context to a story, all too often what we're seeing in the context of conflicts, and in this case, the 12-day war, is instead of clarifying the conflict, they simply confuse their audience further. So for example, we saw in the Financial Times, they claimed that Israel strikes could cause a full-blown war, regional war, as if a full-blown regional war had not already been happening since October 7, 2023, and arguably long before that, given Iran's long-standing, decades-long efforts to establish, what we know as the Ring of Fire around Israel in pursuit of its destruction, using regional countries from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, to try to carry out its genocidal goal. At CNN, we saw a senior analyst claim that, or chastise Israel really, for not having an exit strategy in its conflict with Iran, which is a rather Western-centric or American-centric, bizarre framing for a conflict. We're not talking about Israel going around to the other side of the world to face off against a terrorist organization. We're talking about Israel that has been in a constant battle for 75 plus years for its survival against neighboring countries. And in this case, it was dealing with threats on its border, Lebanon, Gaza, again, Iran not that far. And these were very present existential threats. And the idea that the main question here should be an exit strategy when Israel's exit strategy has always been survival is to completely distort the conflict for its audience. And of course, this is something we see a lot with Gaza in terms of talking about, how do you make peace with a party like Hamas that seeks your destruction? And the inability to convey this to audiences is simply leaving the audiences less informed and less able to understand events. So with that, I'll end my portion, and I'll hand it over to Adam Levick.
Thanks, David. A cartoon depicting a Jewish leader as a puppeteer controlling the British Foreign Secretary, illustrating the Foreign Secretary's alleged slavish subservience to Israel, would be standard fare for the notorious Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer, as well for its modern descendants. Yet, in 2012, The Guardian published a cartoon depicting that very image in response to the UK's tepid support for Israel during their 8-day war with Hamas. In 2019, the New York Times evoked the same anti-Semitic trope about Jewish control of non-Jewish leaders, or alleged Jewish control, when their international edition placed a cartoon on their op-ed page depicting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a dog leading a blind, kippah-wearing Donald Trump. After a wave of criticism, the New York Times deleted the cartoon and offered an apology, albeit a weaselly one. However, the toxic anti-Jewish calumny which inspired these cartoons lives on, sadly, in the mainstream media ecosystem that often seems impervious or indifferent to the impact that such lethal tropes have on the actual lives of Jews. Now let's flash forward to June 20th, 2025, during Israel's 12-day war with Iran, when there was talk at the time, just talk, of the U.S. possibly entering the war to use bunker-busting bombs, weapons that only its military possessed, to take out an Iranian nuclear site at Fordo, a site buried deep underground within an Iranian mountain. On that day, again, this is 2 days before the president's order to the U.S. Air Force, Financial Times U.S. editor, and as Camera UK has demonstrated repeatedly, arguably the most viscerally anti-Israel contributor at the outlet, Edward Luce, wrote the following: Trump's managerial style is usually to encourage squabbling between underlings. That enhances his role as the decider. But it is Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, and not Trump or his loyalists, who has been dictating the agenda. Let me repeat that: dictating the agenda. Luce's use of the word dictating, a word, let's remember, defined as the act of imposing one's will or authority on others, leaves little doubt that he was imputing Israeli control over American decision-making. 2 days later, and again 9 days into the Israel-Iran war, the U.S. president gave the order to the Air Force to deploy a group of B-2 bombers to drop multiple bunker-busting bombs on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities: the Fordo uranium enrichment plant, the Natanz nuclear facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. Luce, the Financial Times editor, used the same word as he used 2 days previously. In an article entitled "Trump Has Opened a Pandora's Box," he included the following: Trump's brief televised address following the strikes was meant to showcase his command of the situation. In reality, however, he said, Netanyahu has been dictating events. In fact, a Financial Times opinion piece by their editorial board, titled "Trump's Step into the Dark," also advanced this theme. Here's the relevant sentences. The Trump administration has allowed Netanyahu, who has long opposed diplomatic efforts with Tehran, to sideline diplomacy and drag Trump into a war that Netanyahu has won for a decade. That is, the U.S. was dragged unwillingly into a war. It's not just the Financial Times. Sticking with the UK again, Andrew Roth, who's the Guardian's global affairs correspondent based in Washington, wrote, again, the day after the U.S. strikes, in an analysis titled "Trump Falls into the Netanyahu Trap," again, the keyword trap, he wrote that it now appears that the Israeli prime minister has maneuvered the U.S. into striking Iranian uranium enrichment sites. He maneuvered the U.S. Again, the U.S. has no agency. It was only the Jewish leader that was assigned agency in this narrative. And the Guardian's veteran columnist Simon Tisdale advanced a similar trope, writing that Trump has walked slap bang into a trap prepared by Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, the tricky Jew. That was my comment, not his. An op-ed by the Guardian's editorial board echoed Tisdale's narrative, writing that Netanyahu lured Trump into the attack. Additionally, former U.S. CIA Chief John Brennan said on the UK show Radio Times, or Times Radio rather, in response to a question from the hosts about why Trump made the decision to bomb Iran, that Bibi pulls a lot of strings in the U.S. political system, including in Congress. Now, again, when I say he said pulling strings, that evokes the cartoon I mentioned that the New York Times ran in 2019. It also evokes the 2012 Guardian cartoon that literally showed Netanyahu as a puppeteer. Sadly, Brennan wasn't challenged by the Times radio host. That was taken as normal, uncontroversial commentary. Now, it wasn't only in the UK where that toxic trope was peddled. On the day of the US attack, MSNBC's Ian Mildin used precisely the same metaphor that had landed in the New York Times in hot water in 2019, when editors ran that political cartoon depicting Netanyahu as a dog leading a blind President Trump. The MSNBC correspondent said, there were questions as to whether or not Israel dog-walked, the Israeli Prime Minister dog-walked President Trump into this war. Classic and anti-Semitic trope. Later that day, MSNBC political analyst Rick Stengel revisited the same theme. The Israeli Prime Minister, according to the MSNBC analyst, managed to find in President Trump somebody who was willing to go with his intelligence over the American community's intelligence. That is, to favor Israel's interests over those of the U.S. Now, these columnists and outlets resorted to the ancient anti-Semitic trope of nefarious Jewish manipulation rather than engaging in anything resembling professional journalistic investigation. Now, such professional investigations, of course, require arduous, nitty-gritty reporting. That is real journalism. Tracking down sources within the White House, determining which of Trump's key foreign policy advisors were in favor of an attack on Iranian nuclear sites versus which ones advised against such an assault, and finally, how Trump made his decision. I'm going to venture to guess that Benjamin Netanyahu was not in the White House Situation Room at that time. Now, such ethical and serious journalism would also include acknowledging that Trump has repeatedly, since at least 2016, stated that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, thus illustrating that the President of the United States' decision to order his military to destroy Iran's nuclear sites was fully consistent with his own views. Further, as my colleague Ricky Hollander noted, the U.S. strike wasn't carried out merely for the benefit of a U.S. ally facing an imminent existential threat from Iran. The U.S. also was endangered by Iran's race to build a nuclear weapon. Death to America, death to Israel has been the refrain at rallies organized by Iran's regime, which labels the U.S. the Great Satan and Israel the Little Satan. And in fact, the Supreme Leader Khamenei has made clear that death to America and death to Israel isn't just a talking point, it's a policy. From the regime's start in 1979, in fact, it occupied the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 66 American hostages and holding 52 of them for 444 days. Iranian military action through its terrorist proxies has killed more than 1,000 American soldiers in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere over decades. And there was more than one attempt by Iran to assassinate the U.S. president. As the Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted, Tehran continues to pose a threat to U.S. forces in the Middle East, the American homeland, and Americans residing across the globe. Finally, the age-old canard of Jews dragging and manipulating unwilling non-Jews into undesirable actions has been used for centuries to fuel Jew hatred and attacks on Jews. And I find it truly alarming, particularly in the context of the tsunami of anti-Semitism post-October 7th, that such intellectually lazy and bigoted narratives of Jewish control, which previously were only heard on the fringes of Western discourse, are employed routinely by mainstream journalists claiming to be reporting objectively and professionally on the extremely serious issues of war and terrorism in the Middle East. Thank you.
We have a lot of excellent questions from the audience, so I'm going to dig in and we'll get through as many as we can. Some specific, some more general about trends. Here's a more specific one. The Washington Post has been very determined to present forensic examination of alleged Israeli indiscriminate attacks on Palestinian and Iranian targets. The latest is the charge that the attack on the Iranian prison complex, the Evin prison, was reckless and imprecise, resulting in many innocent deaths. Can camera refute this alleged precise information? And you can expand it to beyond the Washington Post. I believe the New York Times also had an expose on this. Whoever would like to jump in.
I'll jump in. I'll note I haven't read that particular Washington Post piece, but having seen a lot of investigations over the years, or so-called investigations that supposedly provide, detailed proof of this atrocity or that atrocity, the more you dig into those investigations, the more you often find the shortcomings and the holes in the investigations, and these can come in a number of ways. For example, oftentimes they'll rely on expert testimony or expert analysis. But the moment you start looking into the expert analysis, you realize there's major problems with that expert analysis. For example, it could be a known someone with known biases. Oftentimes, we see news outlets bring in activists and describe them as somehow objective experts. We also see media outlets take one interpretation among many legitimate expert interpretations of a particular set of facts, where there are more than one reasonable interpretations, and a media outlet will select one and depict that as if that's the only legitimate or only serious interpretation of the facts, when in fact there's a lot of controversy. We also see other games played, such as making key omissions, whether it's omitting exculpatory information, or they may omit details about, say, the shortcomings of their methodology or the shortcomings in the evidence that is presented, whether it's hiding the fact that, this evidence or that evidence is based on hearsay, or it's based on, a digital track record that they can't actually trace. There's many reasons that these so-called investigations may have the appearance of being credible, but once you start asking the right questions and looking for the right details, you begin to realize that a lot of these investigations are frankly manufactured to present the desired outcome rather than an investigation to really determine the truth. So, we'll certainly take a look at that Washington Post article if our colleague who covers the Washington Post hasn't already. But on your own, I would encourage all of our listeners to take that critical eye and ask those critical questions of those kind of investigations.
Thank you, David. Excellent points. There's really fantastic questions and a really interesting conversation. I hope people learned a lot. You really provided an eye-opening view of the challenges we face and how camera is addressing them in these historic times. At this critical moment in history, please support our mission of strategic growth so we can amplify our impact and introduce more people to the kind of excellent analyses you just heard. Our supporters both help spread the word about our content and generously enable camera to hire more researchers and add social media creators. With additional research staff, we can cover more content and prompt more improved coverage. With more social media staff, we can ensure that we are recruiting younger audiences and supporters who will help grow our activity and impact for years to come. We can't say what the future holds, not tomorrow, and certainly not in 641 days from now. But whatever it is, with your support, camera will be there in full force and with optimal strategies and tools to meet it. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. This concludes today's program.